long. You never will go wrong. Okie, Anki, any okie, just start the day with a song.
Oh, and I remember one night after work, he took me to the department store. Just him and me, and he bought me my first watch. It was one of those Cinderella watches, you know. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking to myself, this is really special.
Hold on, before we talk too much more about what a narrative spandrel isn't, let's first establish what it is. In order to do that, we must take a brief detour from talking about literature and writing, and look to the fields of evolutionary biology and architecture. Over the course of millennia, a given species will develop certain evolutionary adaptations, or physical traits, such as eyes and wings and fur, that are beneficial to its survival. For example, the color of an animal's coat is directly related to its environment, as we can see by comparing this Arctic fox to this red fox. A polar bear is whiter than the average bear. There are white snow bunnies and brown non-snow bunnies, you get the point. However, not all physical traits, even super useful ones, are direct products of evolutionary adaptation. They're really byproducts, more like a spillover, or what some refer to as a spandrel. A long time ago, in the late 1970s, renowned evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote a really famous article called The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, a critique of the adaptations program. Now, I know what you're all thinking.
One snore. 2, 3, 4, 5 snores.
But it's actually pretty interesting, so bear with me. The gist of it is that in Rome, back in the day, people were really into building arches and going to church. All the cool churches were crammed full of arches, front to back. But when you build two arches next to each other, there's this weird extra space that forms between the tops. The folks at San Marco figured they ought to do something with these spandrels, so they used them as canvases and filled them with elaborate paintings of all their favorite saints. They did such a good job, the spandrels sort of stole the show. A person walking in might assume that the church's original goal was to display the beautiful art, hence they needed loads of spandrels, thus all the entryways became rounded, ergo arches. In fact, the spandrels were merely a byproduct. Gould's argument was that, in the same way, many of the strange and fascinating traits seen in animals were formed not by natural selection, but by environmental constraints. Author Robert Boswell argues in his essay, Narrative Spandrels, that the same model is also applicable when discussing the evolution and architecture of fiction. Which brings us to our main point.
Your point being?
To quote Boswell, paraphrasing Gould, spandrels are often the key to creating an elaborate, harmonious, and purposeful work of fiction. So here's the fiction writer, toiling away, building the primary structures of her work, day in and day out. And in the process, she will inevitably create byproducts, or spandrels, and very often these spandrels will come to guide and shape the story and give the writer the opportunity to create a beautiful and meaningful whole. Boswell purports that stories are primarily structured by scenes. Thus scenes are the fictive equivalent to arches that support a cathedral, which is the second point.
Your point being?
Boswell writes that in the construction of any scene, there are necessarily byproducts, and these byproducts may ultimately determine the difference between good and mediocre fiction. He goes on to say that these spandrels may determine the ultimate design of the narrative mosaic to such an extent that they appear to be the primary units of structure. To illustrate what Boswell is talking about in practical terms, here's a made-up example of a super simplistic scenario of narrative spandrels at work. There you are, sitting at your writing desk, pen in hand, seeing where the spirit so moves. The story you're writing is about a schlubby guy named Fred, and in the scene you're working on today, Fred goes over to his eccentric neighbor Dahlia's house, where some crazy, life-altering plot twists are about to go down. It's a big scene and introduces a big character. Your first order of business is introducing Dahlia to the reader. You're thinking about what Fred might see when he first enters her house that will give the first impression you want. For some reason, you're struck by the idea that Dahlia has dozens of original works of abstract art covering her living room walls. This detail shows us that Dahlia is artsy, rich, kind of a show-off, and probably the type of person who doesn't do things part way. She's also kind of pedantic and seems to take smug satisfaction in the fact that Fred can't identify what any of the paintings are trying to depict. Dahlia promises to tell him what they all mean one day. Apart from that one little moment, you're not quite sure what the abstract paintings have to do with the rest of the story, if anything. But it's cool, you'll revisit the issue later, if necessary. As you move along in the story, you start sensing a pattern, or theme if you will. Fred often doesn't know how to interpret what he's looking at, not only paintings, but people, situations, relationships. He's shocked when several key presences in his life turn out not to be what they seemed on the surface. Of course, it takes the events of your story for him to see the beauty and brokenness that have surrounded him all along. The wheels are turning, you're figuring out your story, and this is the moment when the light bulb goes off in your head and you think, so that's what the abstract art was really all about. It wasn't just about characterizing Dahlia, even more, it was about characterizing Fred. It makes so much sense, right?
Well, no, it makes perfect sense.
Now you're at the point where you sense the story is getting ready to wrap up, though you're not certain when or how, or even what will happen. Fred has accompanied Dahlia to a local gallery. He's eager to learn about her interest in abstract art in a way he never would have been before. It turns out that Dahlia is actually a pretty cool chick, and nothing like our first impression. Of course, we met her through Fred's POV, and he couldn't see people too well back then, though he's come a long way in the past 25 pages. At the art gallery, the moment comes when you, the author, realize how you're gonna land this thing.
Eureka!
There's a final gesture, statement, or confession. Maybe Fred has a revelation, or makes a decision, something that lands him somewhere new and surprising, yet inevitable, and irrevocable. And the key to this shift is inextricably tied to the abstract art surrounding him. All the paintings of weird fruit baskets and broken musical instruments, the same paintings that confused and disinterested him when he went over to Dahlia's house in the first place. This slightly cheesy premise is an example of what writer Stephen Schwartz describes as an element that entered the story in the background, suddenly shifting to the foreground, accruing meaning that the writer had not anticipated. You can see why certain readers might presume that Fred's entire character arc hinged, from the start, on his shifting attitudes towards abstract art. But even though it wasn't, the story now can't stand without it. The narrative spandrel turned out to be a keystone of the piece. Now we come to the point where Robert Boswell and I disagree. According to him, a story without a narrative spandrel in it is nothing short of a travesty.
Oh my god, this is a travesty.
He writes, the importance of spandrels as shaping elements in fiction is often most apparent in stories written without them. Most stories or novels that use consciously imposed details fail. My question is, how does he know that? When these types of details fail, they are surely consciously imposed, poorly. But how would Boswell know if what he identifies as a narrative spandrel wasn't added sometime later than Draft 1, by a writer who knew the story well enough to see how the quote faux spandrel could fit into the story on several levels? In the case of my example about Fred and Dahlia, if the abstract art were simply a telling detail about Dahlia when we first met her, and never re-entered the story, it would not be a true narrative spandrel. While I agree with that, Boswell also says that if a story element doesn't provide the means to a story's resolution, it's not a spandrel. But I'm not sure I'm completely on board with that idea. How about you? You wouldn't have a true narrative spandrel if you went in at the end and backfilled all those details. But that being said, if you do it well enough, who's to know, and who cares? Is it possible to rewrite stories with an eye to recurring themes, sprinkling them throughout the story in different contexts? Can you backfill symbols and even plot points into a story without being contrived? Discuss. The reason I had to make up that story about Fred and Dahlia to give an example of narrative spandrels at work is because I purport there really is no way of telling, just by reading a story, whether a certain crucial element is or is not a spandrel in the strictest sense. In the case of Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, we know the cat Pitty Sing is a narrative spandrel because O'Connor tells us it is. How are we to otherwise know she did not write an entire draft of the story, Sans Pitty Sing, only to get to the end and realize a cat would be a welcome addition right then, to help get the grandmother and the family into a confrontation with the misfit. And not only would a cat work at the end, it could work earlier in the story, to establish the grandmother's character. Surely the skilled writer and reviser can pull off such a trick while avoiding the pitfalls of clunkiness and contrivance, as was the case in this misfire. I hope you've enjoyed this short film exploring the basic tenets of narrative spandrels, and that it will lead into a mutually beneficial further discussion.